Thank you for joining us on another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club at the top of the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. Pleased to have as my guest on this edition, civil rights leader, founder of the Woodson Center, founder and president of the Woodson Center, recent recipient of the William Wilberforce Award, easy for me to say, which we'll be talking about a little bit as well. Bob Woodson. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleased to be here.
Great to have you in Chicago. Why don't we start to some extent at the beginning, or at the beginning of your life and advocacy for black families, advocacy for low-income families. So it's always fun to talk to somebody who was there, right, so to speak. And so your experience in the civil rights movement and how that was sort of a glide path for the work you've done over the last 50 years.
Well, I guess I started as a young civil rights worker in my years in graduate school. I went to Westchester, Pennsylvania, the home of Baird Rustin, prime civil rights leader. Rustin family is very prominent there. And I began to get involved in running the civil rights movement. I was a young renegade, and I opposed one of the older civil rights leaders who was very autocratic. And I deposed him, and at 25 became the leader of the Human Relations Council of Westchester, right in the middle of the civil rights movement. Led demonstrations. The way it worked is Dr. King and Baird Rustin would come through and draw the national press.
Right.
But then we focused on local issues when they left. And so that gave us validation, and we sort of validated them. But then I began to work and against fair housing and you know, the other issues. But I was amazed, and because I began to oppose forced busing for integration. I began to, because I believed that the whole integration piece, that busing, what we should be fighting for is equal opportunity in education. And that could not be achieved by forced busing. Because I think separate, as it was argued, was not inherently unequal, it was strategically unequal. If you argue something is inherently unequal, what you're arguing is that anything is all black is all bad. And so, but the civil rights leaders at the time, my peers, said, well, Bob, your position is consistent with the John Birch Society and the Klan. And my response was, well, if Hitler likes classical music, am I supposed to oppose it?
You can't go see Wagner's Ring Cycle.
No,
yeah.
Because after all, so I said one doesn't take their position based upon who agrees or disagrees. So that was the first bump. The second bump came when we led demonstrations outside of Wyatt Laboratories to desegregate their workforce. And after 3 months, they hired 9 black PhD chemists. When we asked them to join this movement, they said they got these jobs on merit and not because of what we did. And so I realized that the civil rights movement was a kind of a bait and switch game where we used the demographics of all blacks for the protest, and then when the doors of opportunity opened, only middle-class blacks like myself could walk through it. And so I left the civil rights movement at that point when I realized that a lot of people who were janitors, hairdressers, ordinary factory workers, their condition, that were not a priority. And so I left the civil rights movement.
And this isn't about what year?
About 67, 68. And then Dr. King got killed at that point when I was about to leave. And I was called back to town to see if we could stop the rioting. So I remember driving back in and seeing the smoke. But what I did to stop from anyone being killed, I got in my car and I identified 9 community-based, non-civil rights activists, people who were grassroots leaders in that community whom I had known, and because they are the one that had the trust and confidence of these youthful rioters.
They had standing.
They had standing. And so I mobilized them and said, we got to get in front of this. So we interposed ourselves between the National Guard and the police and asked these young people to stop rioting. Now, the leader of the NAACP came out with pastor with his collar, and the kids almost attacked him. So I said, you're going to get me killed. So I pushed him in the doorway and stood in front of them. But we were able to successfully prevent any loss of life. And so then I organized the next day. I said we should meet at the community center 500 low-income blacks met at the community center, and I realized that low-income blacks were not represented by the civil rights leadership. And so I helped them form their own organization called the Black Action Committee. So, and they wanted to make me the leader. I said, no, I'm not the one who stopped this riot, you did. So I said, no, I will serve as a consultant and advisor to you, but the leadership should be the people who had the standing who stopped the riots. And so I established that there's a big bifurcation in the black community between civil rights leadership and the interests of low-income blacks.
And why is it that the civil rights leaders from whom you broke away, why did they win the day, and have they won the day over the last 50 years? Well,
because they've got access to the media. The media prefers people well-educated. There's a good level of elitism that continues to persist today, on the both left and the right. Mm-hmm. We tend to discount the views and opinions and experiences of untutored people.
Yeah.
And so
there was a little bit of a reckoning in 2016 because of that. I mean, across the racial lines.
That's what this 2016 election was all about. That both Republicans and Democrats became detached from the realities of ordinary Americans, particularly blue-collar and low-income people. And so they became detached from that, and that's why you have this huge separation today.
So was the move for forced busing, was that a strategic error by the civil rights leaders?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You got to understand that there's no monolithic black community. If you do polling, low-income people poll on choice in education. 60% of low-income blacks support choice in charter schools. 60% supported Clarence Thomas being ascended to the Supreme Court. Only 5% of well-educated middle-class blacks and leaderships supported Clarence Thomas. So there's always been, people don't realize there is no monolithic black community.
So, but when people think about the black community as a monolith politically, because, right, for the last 40 plus years, it's been 90 to 95% in the Democrat camp. So why is that? How do you reconcile the differences of opinions on issues with the coming together behind Democrats?
Well, I think, because it was the Republicans who fought for the civil rights movement. But it was also when Barry Goldwater ran for president and opposed the civil rights,
right,
and people lined up. There was a realignment in the country of Goldwater Republicans, anti-civil rights, and so there was a Southern strategy,
right,
to then recruit disaffected Democratic Dixiecrats into the Republican Party. And so you saw that shift. And so then the allegiance began to shift to the Democratic Party. And that, unfortunately, and I wrote about this, civil rights leaders in the civil rights movement began to switch their allegiance. The civil rights movement was never aligned with a party. King was neutral on politics. But all of that changed when the poverty programs came into existence.
Great Society.
The Great Society came in, and then blacks at the same time got the voting rights bill. And so they got elected to office. Instead of using this power, political power, to promote the kind of self-help initiatives that defined the black community prior to the 60s, they shifted their allegiance because the poverty programs put money into the hands of newly elected black officials. And so they used that money to fund a lot of their friends, and a lot of associates and consulting firms were set up. And so what is happening is only 2 out of 10 whites with college education today works for government. 6 out of 10 blacks do.
So is this the old story of a cause becomes a movement, becomes a business?
Yes. It declines from a cause to a business.
Yeah, degenerates, right?
Degenerates. But there's also, and I don't have time to unpack it all, but what you have to understand, that race and poverty was never associated with misbehavior or aberrant behavior. racism never caused violence and crime in the black community. Race and lack of opportunity never decimated the family, because between 1930 and 1940, when the unemployment rate for the nation was 25%, 40% in the black community, negative gross national product, the black marriage rate was higher than any other group. Mm-hmm. Elderly blacks could walk in their community without being afraid of their grandchildren. So if race and racism, and there was the jury racism then, right. No political power. In fact, what I talked about, there were 5 black high schools in the 1920s in each of the major cities, Atlanta, Boston, Washington, D.C., where the actually enrollment was like 50 to a class using old textbooks. They outscored every white school in those cities. So under conditions where there was absolute separation, a lack of funding. In fact, this is a fascinating, between 1920 and 1940 in the South, the unemployment among white males and black males was whites for 8th grade and blacks for 5th grade. But in less than 20 years, that gap closed within 6 months. And that's because Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears,
funded the schools.
Funded the schools. He funded half of them. And Booker T. Washington, 5,000 Rosenwald schools were built, but half of that money was contributed by local black communities. And so it was this spirit of and activity of self-help within the black community that caused us to close the gap during the 1920s to the 1940s to within 6 months.
And Thomas Sowell makes the point too. I think the last time the black unemployment rate was lower than the white unemployment rate was the early 30s. Right. Exactly. So when you had institutional oppression of black people, you're talking about the gap in education was narrowing almost to be indistinguishable. Unemployment was actually in a better position. So under oppression by law, that's the case. And now, fast forward almost 90 years, and you know, how has the promise of the Great Society or Brown versus Board of Education been realized or not?
It's interesting. In 1965, 62, the black family, probably about 85% of all black families had a man and a woman raising children. Then the cliff, we fell off a cliff between then and today. The question is, how did this happen? At a time when blacks were running most of the social systems. Well, some liberals at New York, I'm blocking,
Columbia.
But Columbia School of Social Work, Allen and Piven, the couple.
Yeah, right.
Remember
Cloud and Piven.
Yeah, Cloud and Piven. They came up with, they said, well, what we need to do is change the culture. That if we can separate work from income, then you will see an increase in school dropout rates, drug addiction, all of these things decline. That the way that we can show the inconsistencies about the American system is to flood the welfare system with people. But there was a stigma in the black community about being on relief. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what we did was they culturally redefined it and said that welfare went from social insurance to reparations, and that the nuclear family of a man and a woman was Eurocentric and therefore racist, to hold blacks to that standard. And so this was and then it was also supported by the Black Power movement that also said that was a racist configuration, but it couldn't just, and so we had to remove the stigma. But it couldn't be just done by making public pronouncements. But the government stepped up. The Office of Equal Opportunity stepped up and opened offices to actively recruit people into the welfare system. So we had, within 4 years, millions of blacks in New York and Chicago and others flooding into the welfare system. And they were recruited. The welfare system lawsuits were filed for privacy. You couldn't inquire of a woman of paternity or whether or not they were deserving of support. And in fact, the Community Service Society, a social service agency, stopped offering services to unwed mothers because there was no pathology there. Mm-hmm. And so as a consequence of blacks flooding into the welfare system in the course of 3 or 4 years, at a time when the unemployment rate was just 4%, there was a labor shortage in the garment industry at a time when the welfare, so it just mushroomed. And as a consequence, what Moynihan reported on, right, there was just out of wedlock birth soared. And as the family disintegrated, crime went up and disorganization within the community. But that is a recent phenomenon. So those who say, well, what you're seeing is a legacy of slavery and discrimination, it's just patently a lie.
So the civil rights movement, you know, you hate to get into motivations, but in terms of trying to understand why things went down the way they did, you have to assess motives sometimes. And so I wonder if you think this was just the road to hell is paved with good intentions, or it was something more pernicious.
It's much more pernicious. You know, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, one of the most difficult human phenomena to address is not malice, because you can confront malice with violence. It's folly. It's when people think they're doing something to help you when they're destroying you with the helping hand. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened. But there are also some powerful economic incentives. 70% of the $22 trillion that we have spent on the poor over the last 50 years goes not to the poor, but those who serve poor people. Business. And they ask which problems are fundable as opposed to which ones are solvable. So now you've got middle-class blacks heavily represented in the services industry, social services, foster care, adoption, all these things. So their income depends upon having large groups of people to serve. So the poor have become a commodity in our society. So it doesn't matter how compassionate you may be, if your income depends upon me being dependent on you, it doesn't matter how compassionate you may feel, your strategic interest is hostile to my strategic interest.
So it's the misalignment of incentives within the bureaucracy, just as it is the welfare state towards the recipients.
Exactly.
And so then you overlay the political component, and Democrats long ago figured out that the best way to ensure a reliable Democrat vote is to make somebody dependent on the state.
Right, and use race to convince people that their problem is race. All of these failures, if race were the problem, the question is, why are poor blacks failing in systems run by their own people? And the answer that comes from, well, it's institutional racism. What does that mean? If you believe that white people can compel black people to injure themselves against their will, then you are a white supremacist. If you believe white people got that much power, right, that they can compel a principal or a superintendent or a school to miseducate low-income black kids, you believe that white people got that much power, that all we got to do is get a hold of that device that they point to people that causes them to engage in this kind of self-destruction. I don't think such a remote exists.
Well, and so then the other thing, to me, it always seems remarkable, and there are people who point this out, but it just doesn't seem like it takes hold. I mean, isn't it the great insult to say that you as a black man or you as a black woman don't have agency over your own life, and you don't, and also even worse than that, not only do you not possess it, you don't have the capacity for it.
Right. Absolutely. It is the most insulting implication of all of this, to say to people that you are like an impotent child. Mm-hmm. That's why what the Woodson Center does is we turn all of this on its head. And that is, we go into low-income, high-crime neighborhoods rather than looking for the 70% of the families that are raising children that are dropping out of school and going to jail, we go to the 30% and ask, how are you achieving against the odds?
Replicate success.
And then go in and replicate success. Only 3% of people in the American economy are entrepreneurs, but they generate 70% of the jobs. That's where the creativity is. And just incidentally, that people who create those jobs are C students, not A students.
Right. And many college dropouts, too.
Well, A students come back to universities and teach. C students endow.
Yeah. Yeah. I was an A student. So that explains it all. But here's the thing about that, though. You know, with respect to entrepreneurship, I read a piece you wrote this past February for The Hill, thehill.com, about Black History Month. And it was essentially sort of kind of the history we should be focusing on and celebrating. And it was, at least the part of the column was about elevating the success stories, elevating the history of the successful Black entrepreneur, the richest woman in L.A., you know, almost 100 years ago and stuff. So why aren't those stories told?
It does not fit the pathology narrative. Liberals like to believe they stay in power, and people, by perpetuating that because of slavery and whatnot, blacks are America's perpetual victim. And so that is continued. And there are people who profit off of that. That's why what the Woodson Center promotes is that people are motivated to achieve not by constantly reminding them of injuries to be avoided, but by telling them victories that are possible. I mean, think about it. You're a coach and you say to your team, listen, these other teams getting ready to get on the field, they beat us 3 times before, they're bigger than we are, they hit harder.
Right.
Go out there and try not to get killed.
We forfeit, right, yeah.
Yeah, you forfeit so that it is you got to promote what we do, and a winning attitude. You say to people, you can achieve against the odds. So that if you want to replicate success, find people who are achieving against the odds. Historically, I said there are 20 blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. When blacks were refused access to hotels, we built our own hotels. The St. Teresa in New York, the St. Charles in Chicago, the Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver and Calvert Hotel in Overtown in Miami. I could go on and on and on. When we were denied access we started our own railroad. In 1868, 1,000 blacks were fired for striking for higher wages. So they went to the churches that were our burial societies, those were our insurance companies, and borrowed $10,000 to start the Chesapeake, Maine Dry Dock and Railroad Company. And we successfully operated a railroad from Baltimore to Maine and hired whites along the way. And so it is this rich history of achieving against the odds that we've got to go back and recapture and communicate this to the public, particularly to young blacks, to say, if we did this then, we can do it now.
So from your experience at the Woodson Center and with the people that you work with and the success stories you have, what are the takeaways for people to say, okay, Bob, even if I agree with how we got here, but now you're talking about trying to kind of unwind the welfare state. You're talking about trying to put families back together when you've got illegitimacy rates at, you know, hovering around 70% in the black community and not too far behind in Latino and white communities, oh, by the way. So how do you do it?
We have done it. If you were to go on 60 Minutes and type in Bertha Gilkey, 60 Minutes. This is one of our groups in St. Louis.
Okay.
That totally went in on a period of 10 years and reclaimed those communities. I think what Pastor Brooks is doing right here Corey Brooks is an example. He has the foundation of the restoration. It begins with individual redemption and transformation. And Kenilworth Parkside in public housing project in Washington, D.C. used to be a drug and alcohol infested. But the residents took charge. One woman who was Kimmy Gray, she was abandoned by her husband through a divorce to public housing with 5 kids and 22 years old. She got off welfare in 3 years and sent all 5 kids to college. Other people said, can you help us? She started a movement in her own project that resulted in them, the residents council taking over, driving out the drug addicts. And in the course of 10 years, sent 650 kids to college from this one public house, eliminating teen pregnancy, eliminating violence from that community. So what she has done is applying those old values to a new urban reality. So there are examples of what I call islands of excellence that have been recreated based upon the old principles that have been applied in this new circumstance. So what we need to do is to study that process. How did these folks today are able to do it? And then began to recruit other people and publicize it, put them on television, make them the lead story. Again,
these are the solutionists you talk about.
Another point, think about this. 60% of Apple's income comes from a product that didn't exist 6 or 7 years ago.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Well, why can't the same spirit of entrepreneurship prevail in the social world? Why can't we have an explosion of moral excellence in America again? And that's why the Wilberforce Award that I got, I was studying Wilberforce, 20 people came together in Great Britain to fuel a movement to change a whole culture, and they did it within 20 years. When Britain's economy was dependent upon the slave trade, if they were able to change, stop the moral and spiritual freefall that existed there, if they were able to achieve what they did by changing the culture, why can't we apply that same to change the culture in this country?
How important it is to change the culture in a colorblind way? I note you were recently in Chicago just a little while ago for a Jack Kemp Foundation Forum, and it was a panel on the plight of black families in America. And you were different than some of the other panelists. You made the point that you're not in the business of helping black people. You're in the business of helping poor people.
Right.
Black, white, Latino, whatever. And so why was it so important for you to make that distinction?
Because there are people who are pimping the race issue on both sides. There are I said to people, I have suffered my last guilty white person and my last rich, angry black person.
All right, so no.
Both are hustling this country's, hustling the race issue. That this polarization of white privilege, I mean, that white mother who lost her daughter in Silicon Valley to suicide. Suicide rate among white teenagers in Silicon Valley is 6 times the national average. And that black mother in public housing in D.C. who lost her daughter to a drive-by shooting. Her problem, the mother in Silicon Valley's problem isn't white privilege. And that black mother's problem isn't systemic racism. They suffer from a moral decline in America. And only moral restoration will protect that white mother's child and that black mother's child. So if we really want to reclaim this country, we've got to come together across race lines and stop the race grievance people on both the left and the right. And instead come in and engage in the restoration of the community. Because if we can come together and help low-income people of all races to live a more full and more complete life, then we can partner in doing something. That's what we need to do.
Is that possibility, perhaps, a bit of counterintuitive from the landscape, but is that possibility greater in the black community than in other demographics because of the tradition of faith, because the secularization that's occurring in America generally is not occurring as fast in the black community as is, say, white Protestants or even white Catholics, and the foundation of faith for that moral restoration.
Foundation of faith is essential, not just for black kids, but I think that's why white kids are leaving the traditional church. Southern Baptists are losing kids in droves. The evangelicals are losing kids. And you know why? It's because a lot of those churches have become Pharisee churches. They keep preaching about moral conduct, and they don't preach about love. And so white evangelical kids come to the city and they see secularists, secular humanists, feeding people, helping them to get out of jail. And so they say, oh, then maybe it's the secularists who are more providing more loving care to people than the people who are religious. So I think that people of faith have to step up and do more of what the traditional church did. And that is to less engage in loving people, but also coming and helping people to help themselves.
Serving.
Exactly. Be a servant. And that's why in my book, The Triumphs of Joseph, I said that the relationship between the rich and poor should be what it is in Genesis between the good Pharaoh. The good Pharaoh was powerful, but he was able to dream bad dreams in good times.
And so thinking about that, though, just in terms of that moral restoration and faith being a component of that, the cultural institutions are moving towards secularization much faster than the populace at large, and to some extent that has brought in their legitimacy into question. But how do you recapture the presence of moral instruction in the K through 12 public school system, in the arts, in those institutions that drive culture and influence people's decisions about how they're going to live their life and what kind of life they want to live? We've
got to take a lot of the conservative people who believe in these principles and make it as exciting as they do when they give $1 billion for a political campaign.
Okay.
If a fraction of their money they're willing to write to a political lobbyist, if they would take a fraction of that money and invest it in grassroots faith-based organizations that embody those principles and do what the Wilberforce 20 did to began to promote movies, began to engage in a ground game and make it popular again. And you see it, you see this deep desire for moral competence when a homeless man in Boston who's 46 years old finds $40,000 in a knapsack and turns it into the police, and someone posts it on the internet. They raised $96,000 in 3 days for them. That happened 4 times. That says to me that America are thirsting to reward virtue. But we don't have institutions around to give more concrete expression to that deep desire that's within the DNA of the country. So what we're trying to do at the Woodson Center is to provide the vehicle for people to sign up so that we can begin to support institutions that are embodying these principles and are implementing alternatives. And from there, we can do a better job of marketing these values and help to satisfy this thirst that is within the body of the American people.
So Woodson Center, not only the work that you do, but also acting as sort of a bit of a quality control clearinghouse.
Yes.
Saying that, separating all of the organizations that are out there, these are the people, or these are the organizations that provide examples of success that we're trying to scale, and some of these other organizations are just kind of engaged in, extending the status quo.
Well, what we're trying to do is promote the principle, not just the individual, but we want to say, what are some of the indications that this kind of faith-based group is legitimate. Mm-hmm. Some of the criteria, I call it the Joseph principles. For one, organizations at the local level who do not start as a consequence of funding
right.
tend to be more legitimate. They share the same cultural...
And more entrepreneurial.
And entrepreneurial. Most venture capitalists looked for an honest entrepreneur with a good idea, but they also know that entrepreneurs tend to make poor bookkeepers. So they need capital, but they also need assistance. So the Woodson Center provides assistance to these social entrepreneurs so they can be good stewards with money. And so, for instance, there's a guy in Indianapolis, Kurt Moore, spent 13 years in federal prison, came out through one of my faith-based churches, came to himself, and started a car washing business. He now has 25 people, but he has no credit. He has to pay 20% on equipment. So I connected him with a Christian business guy, and so I call them enterprise partners. Yeah. And so they partnered, and now he has 2 car detailing facilities, a line of credit at the bank, and now he's employing about 25 people coming out of prison as their first job. Well, there are hundreds of entrepreneurial opportunities like that, and if we can make that Pharaoh-Joseph connection, we can begin to seed this all over the country.
That's cool. And I know you were friends with Chuck Colson, Prison Fellowship, and you do work with ex-offenders. Like, this is a good example of the work that you do. And so when an issue is hot, and it becomes an issue that's hot for both political parties, so kind of the political power structure, like criminal justice reform, you know, what's the possibility, the potential of this as one of those kind of breakthrough issues that leads you to thinking about K through 12 education, thinking about higher ed, thinking about access to capital, thinking about the range of other issues that get people away from looking to the state and more to looking to themselves?
I think that in every case where we're trying to convince people that devolution through authority to individuals, and that everybody has capacity and everyone has a desire to be self-governing, that we need to tell more parables. Parables convince people, not data.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the more we can demonstrate in these various venues that people can get off of drugs, that if people can find moral competence and restoration and redemption in the midst of these drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods, maybe they have something to teach those who are addicted in these gilded ghettos of Palo Alto. And so there is the common ground. If you say to a mom in Palo Alto that we can help your young son and your young daughter find content and meaning to their lives by partnering with us who have found it. I brought 25 urban black and brown kids who had been redeemed with 25 wealthy white unredeemed kids for 3 days together so that my kids could teach into them. And then we had a session at the end of the 3 days to ask what lessons had been learned.
So that was very much similar to like the Starbucks racial sensitivity training?
Not quite. No, we didn't say to those whites, oh, you're a fact of white privilege. No, we said we're all broken in God's country.
We're all baristas.
We're all broken. And we all need to be repaired. And if you have been repaired, then teach me, show me what God has shown you. That's the spirit. And I think that will, the byproduct of will be racial reconciliation. But what we ought to understand is there's common brokenness. And that mom can turn to a mom in the inner city whose child has been redeemed and find a path towards redemption for her child, I think America will be a better place.
What about, you know, passing these lessons down, these experiences down, these successes down to sort of the next generation, and speaking specifically in the, among kind of African American intelligentsia? So there's guys like you and Sol and Walter Williams and Shelby Steele. Do you see that next generation, you know, one generation or two generations removed from you, that are picking up the work that you guys did in your different disciplines and your different paths, and amplifying it and kind of extending it and building on the foundation that you guys have laid to drive some of these approaches that you're describing here?
Yeah, I think you got to operate at many levels. Certainly there's an intellectual level that has to be fought. I tend to believe that people are more convicted when they see evidence.
Operational level.
Operational level. I mean,
Yeah.
I support what my colleagues do, but I choose to convict through example. I just think examples is much more effective in convicting people of why change is important.
But are you concerned that identity politics is subsuming not just the intellectuals, but the people that would otherwise be at the operational level like you're describing?
Yeah, but I really think that people who believe as we believe, they need to invest more. They need to invest. The left has a ground game. George Soros is investing in the election of district attorneys in cities. Mm-hmm. And I go into low-income neighborhoods, and he has a scholarship program or a stipend. He's giving it to 20 ex-offenders for 18 months so that they can provide counsel to grassroots leaders. You know, what do conservatives give? They give it to scholars. They give it to people who write about other people. They don't give it to doers. I said that if the conservative movement today were around and fighting the Second World War, and we were facing the invasion of Normandy, they would have an Air Force and a Navy and bomb the hell out of the beach and wait for Hitler to surrender on the beach. They would not have a Marines and an Army. And what we need today is a Marine and the Army. And the Marine and the Army are the grassroots leaders and groups that the Woodson Center supports.
Street fighters.
Street fighters. We gotta do, cultural war has to have a ground game. And that ground game is to take these values of our founders and insinuate them into the culture in a way that people can see that it produces a superior life, that it can transform a drug addict, it can transform a predator to an ambassador of peace, that when you transform and redeem individuals, it can result in the revitalization of a whole neighborhood. We've got to have examples of moral excellence in action. That's what we are to have as our goal. How do we begin to develop, you know, places where moral excellence is on display?
Incubators, right?
Incubators.
So then, and this is pertinent for me to a radio show. I mean, it's sometimes, you know, it's easy, so you get lazy. And so would you say that focusing on a school district in the north suburbs that is having faculty meetings by race, you know, all the black faculty here, we have this meeting, all the white faculty here, we have this meeting, or the campus outrage du jour, that we spend too much time kind of railing against identity politics and not enough time building an alternative model?
I think we have to do both. We have to push against that. But it has to be more than complaining about what they're doing.
But is victory going to come from the outside, or is victory we're going to insinuate ourselves in the entertainment industry, in K through 12 education, in academia, and we're going to win through a fifth column action someday when we get inside, or is it going to come from the outside and we're going to build a model and people are going to say this model sucks and I'm going over to that model?
Well, again, that's why I think we should study what Wilberforce and them did.
Yeah.
That's why it's important to study a model And also in the 1840s in America, we had a major Reformation, and that's when
Great Awakening.
An awakening. So we need to go back and look at some of those awakenings, study them, and look at them and say, well, how did they do it then? How did Wilberforce do it? How did the awakening occur in America? And then how do we bring within a few decades, how do we bring about change? How can we apply those old values to a new vision today?
And are you seeing these success stories that come out of the Woodson Center then also starting to be force multipliers? You provide a path to success for an ex-offender or just somebody who's an entrepreneur, and then they're coming back and reinvesting, and it starts to become self-sustaining.
Right. I was telling my colleagues, I had a young ex-gang member who, Wayne Lee, big 6'5", 290-pound guy that he used to, and I took him into my life. He's my adopted son.
Okay.
And he lived with us for 6 months. So, but he has now come to himself, and he's been peaceful. He's raising his 2 children by other women, but he has taken them and he's married now, raising his 2 boys. And several of the fellows are doing that. And when I asked them what are their sons doing, one of them, his son, is graduating from with a 4.0 average on the way to Clemson in computer science. Another one is at a boarding school in Texas, and now is a black cowboy. He ropes cattle and does all this stuff. In other words, it's fascinating to see once the transformation occurs within a single generation, to see how those values are being communicated to their children. But again, we got to study success. I want to see some researchers interview 50 to 200 of these transformed gang members to find out how is it affecting their children. You see what I mean? But you've got to believe it's important to have this knowledge in order to study it.
Well, and also too, so learning the lessons of your ancestors a bit. So there's some interesting examples too that give, I think, some hope. One is Eli Steele, Shelby Steele's son, who's become a documentarian, and he's really challenging. And because of the unique racial composition of his family being multiracial, he's got this great documentary, How Jack Became Black, and he's sort of challenging the orthodoxy and sort of mind scrambling people about race, which is fun. And then also, just recently on my radio program, I interviewed this guy, Maj Touré, who's doing workshops around the country for urban people, black, but not just black, when it comes to Second Amendment rights, and like learning how to defend yourself, being a law-abiding gun owner, but learning how to defend yourself, exercise your Second Amendment rights where the civilian political authorities have abdicated, like, say, I don't know, Chicago. And he said to me, so I said, well, how are you treated by Black Lives Matter? And he's like, well, they can't quite come at me like they could come at you. And so he kind of gets the game that they're running, and he's using it to his advantage. He's kind of backing them down, like, you can talk to this guy like that, but you can't talk to me like that, right?
Right.
And so that's sort of kind of next generation, and then recognizing the scams that they're running and using their scams against them. Maybe that provides some hope too.
Absolutely, but we've got to begin to understand that this is a cultural war that we're in. Yeah. But the war will not be won by just emphasizing what the other side is doing wrong. We must present people with, and every time I go to speak, I spoke to a group of 100 black MBAs. Not a single one of them knew anything about the history of blacks in business. I remember speaking to a group of undergraduates at a black college, and when I talked about all of the things that blacks have done, I had a young lady come to me in tears. She said, Mr. Woodson, why aren't we taught this? I always thought that our history has been from slave ships to plantations to ghettos to welfare. Right. I never knew we had a rich tradition of entrepreneurship, of the real McCoy. That's of a black engineer who can only give, was because of his color, was given a job here in Chicago of oiling the wheels in trains and develop a device so that his wheels become self-lubricating. And he became a millionaire. And that's where the term, I want the real McCoy, because people tried to replicate his invention. They said, no, I want the real McCoy. Mm-hmm. Well, very few people know that's he's black. And so that's where we've got to emphasize example after example of success in the face of opposition. But we've got to have a multi-pronged approach. Intellectual plane, videos, movies, talk shows, but it can't be defined by Fox.
Right, and you gotta have the kind of the entrepreneurial set, the kind of the venture philanthropist.
Right.
Engage.
You really do, and again, I'm going to be addressing in about a week a group of wealthy Republican and conservative funders. And I'm just going to have to tell them the truth, that they're too willing to write. While they're opposing big government, they spend $1 billion trying to get people elected to run big government.
Right. The irony is lost on them. Well, how does that, how do wealthy donor class types respond to your message? You've been giving it for a long time.
I think that given the turmoil that has existed and the failures of what they have been doing up to this point, is causing many of them to take a second look.
So that's a hopeful sign too.
It's a very hopeful sign. In conflict and confusion, there's opportunity.
There you go. There you go. All right, well, let's end on a couple of hopeful signs. He's Bob Woodson. He's the founder and president of the Woodson Center. Bob, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.